My family cut me off completely the week I told them I intended to marry a schoolteacher instead of the wealthy heiress they had already picked out for me. My father sat across from me at his own dinner table and told me plainly that a man who chose sentiment over strategy had no place carrying the family name forward. He meant it. He removed me from the family business within a month. He removed my name from every account, every property, every future conversation about what came next for our family's company. I walked out of that house with nothing but a suitcase and a woman named Rachel who never once asked me what I had given up for her. 10 years later, my father's company sat on the edge of complete liquidation, drowning in debt nobody outside a small circle of lawyers and bankers understood yet, weeks away from losing everything he had spent 4 decades building. A private buyer emerged, structured entirely through blind trusts and holding companies, offering to acquire the controlling stake and settle every outstanding debt in full. My father had no idea, walking into that final negotiation, that the anonymous buyer sitting across the table from him was the son he had disowned for choosing love over legacy. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me if your family ever tried to control who you were allowed to love. Let's get into exactly how this happened. My name is Nathaniel Corbin, and I am 42 years old. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, in a large colonial house on a quiet, tree-lined street where every neighbor understood exactly which families held real influence in the city, and which ones simply lived comfortably beside them. My father, Harrison Corbin, ran a mid-size chemical distribution company called Corbin Industrial Supply, a business his own father had founded decades earlier and grown steadily into one of the largest independent distributors along the eastern seaboard. My mother, Alina, came from a family with its own established standing in Wilmington's business community, and their marriage, I understood from a young age, had been built as much on strategic alignment between two prominent families as on any particular romantic affection between them. I do not say that unkindly. It was simply the water I grew up swimming in, the specific understanding that marriage in our family functioned as a business decision dressed in the language of love. I was an only child, which meant every expectation my father carried for the future of Corbin Industrial Supply rested entirely on me, without any sibling to share or deflect that weight. I attended private schools throughout my childhood, excelled academically without much visible effort, and by the time I reached my teenage years, I understood clearly that my life's trajectory had already been mapped out in considerable detail. I would attend a respected university, study business, return to work directly under my father, eventually marry someone whose family connections would strengthen Corbin Industrial Supply's position within Delaware's business community, and eventually take over the company myself. I did not initially resist this plan. I want to be honest about that. Through my college years at the University of Pennsylvania, studying business exactly as expected, I largely accepted the life being built for me, dadding occasionally within the specific social circle my parents approved of, working summer internships at Corbin Industrial Supply, learning the business from the ground floor exactly as my father intended. The specific person my family had identified as my eventual wife was a woman named Victoria Ashworth, whose family owned a substantial commercial real estate portfolio across the Mid-Atlantic region. Victoria and I had known each other since childhood, moved in the same social circles, and by the time I graduated college in 2005, our families had begun discussing our eventual marriage with a specific matter-of-fact seriousness that treated the outcome as essentially settled. I did not dislike Victoria. I want to be fair in describing her, since she plays only a small role in this story despite everything that eventually unfolded around her. She was intelligent, capable, and perfectly pleasant company. What existed between us, however, never carried anything beyond a comfortable familiarity, the specific flat warmth of two people who had been placed beside each other by circumstance rather than drawn together by any genuine spark. I joined Corbin Industrial Supply formally in 2006, working directly under my father, learning the operational and financial details of the business with the specific intensity of someone determined to eventually run it well. My father was a demanding teacher, precise and often difficult to satisfy, but I respected his knowledge of the industry completely, and for several years, our working relationship, if not always warm, remained genuinely productive. Everything shifted in the fall of 2008 when I met Rachel Doyle. Rachel worked as a fourth-grade teacher at a public elementary school in a working-class neighborhood on the other side of Wilmington, a part of the city my family rarely had reason to visit and viewed, when they thought about it at all, with a kind of distant, unexamined condescension. We met through an entirely unremarkable circumstance, a flat tire on a rainy October evening, when Rachel pulled over to help me change it, having grown up, as she explained cheerfully while I fumbled with a jack I barely understood how to use, in a family where everyone learned basic car maintenance out of simple necessity rather than convenience. She was nothing like anyone my family had ever introduced me to. She spoke plainly, without any of the careful social calculation I had grown up surrounded by. She asked genuine questions and actually listened to the answers rather than waiting for her turn to speak. She had grown up modestly, the daughter of a plumber and a hospital receptionist, and she carried herself with a specific unguarded warmth that I found, almost immediately, more compelling than anything I had encountered in years of carefully curated social circles. We began seeing each other secretly at first, not out of any dramatic scheme, but simply because I was uncertain in those early months how to introduce something so far outside my family's expectations without immediately triggering a confrontation I did not yet feel prepared to have. Over the following year, what began as a quiet, uncertain connection grew into something I genuinely could not imagine walking away from. Rachel challenged the specific version of myself I had built to satisfy my father's expectations, asking me directly, on more than one occasion, whether I actually wanted the life being planned for me or simply believed I had no other option available. I told my parents about Rachel in the spring of 2010, nearly 18 months into our relationship. Once I understood clearly that I intended to marry her regardless of how the conversation went. I remember that dinner with total clarity, because it remains, even now, one of the most difficult conversations of my life. My father set down his fork when I finished explaining who Rachel was and what I intended to do. He said, "Nathaniel, I want to understand this clearly. You're telling me you intend to marry a public school teacher instead of Victoria?" I said, "Yes. I've been seeing Rachel for over a year. I love her and I intend to marry her." He said, "This isn't a decision you're permitted to make unilaterally. Your marriage to Victoria isn't simply a personal matter. It's a strategic alignment this family has been building toward for over a decade." I said, "I understand that's how you see it, but I don't intend to marry someone based on strategic alignment. I intend to marry someone I actually love." My mother, sitting quietly through most of this exchange, finally spoke. She said, "Nathaniel, love is a wonderful thing in its proper place, but you have responsibilities to this family that extend well beyond your own personal happiness." I said, "I understand you both see it that way. I'm telling you respectfully that I don't agree, and I intend to marry Rachel regardless of how this family responds." My father's expression shifted into something colder than I had ever seen directed at me before. He said, "Then I want you to understand exactly what that decision costs. If you marry this woman, you forfeit any future role in this company. You forfeit any future inheritance from this family. You forfeit the name Corbin carrying any of the weight it has always carried for you." I said, "I understand." He said, "I don't think you do, Nathaniel. I don't think you understand at all what you're about to throw away over sentiment." I did not respond to that final comment. I simply stood, thanked them for dinner, and left. The following month unfolded exactly as my father had promised. I was formally removed from any operational role at Corbin Industrial Supply. My name was removed from every family account and trust document that had previously included me as a beneficiary. My father instructed the company's attorneys to draft a formal statement removing me as heir apparent to the business. A document I later learned had been distributed quietly among the company's senior leadership to eliminate any lingering confusion about the succession plan going forward. I married Rachel that same year, in a small ceremony attended by her family and a handful of my own friends, who had chosen loyalty to me over deference to my parents' wishes. My own mother and father did not attend. The following decade unfolded very differently from the life my father had once mapped out for me. Rachel and I moved into a modest apartment near her school, and I want to be honest that the first several years carried real financial difficulty. A specific adjustment neither of us had fully anticipated when I walked away from my family's business and its considerable resources. I took a position as a mid-level analyst at a regional industrial equipment distributor based in Philadelphia, a company entirely unconnected to my father's business, doing work that drew on the operational and financial knowledge I had built during my years at Corbin Industrial Supply, but starting essentially from the bottom of an unfamiliar organization, rather than as the heir apparent I had once been. I want to describe honestly how different this period felt from everything I had known before. Rachel continued teaching, and between our two modest incomes, we built a life defined far more by genuine partnership than by any of the strategic calculation I had grown up surrounded by. We argued sometimes, the way any real couple does, but we also built something I had never previously experienced, a relationship where I was valued entirely for who I actually was rather than for what my family name or eventual inheritance represented. Over the following several years, I advanced steadily within the industrial distribution industry, eventually moving to a larger company based in Pittsburgh in 2014, where I took on increasing responsibility for supply chain strategy and vendor relationships across a substantial regional territory. By 2017, I had been promoted to a senior operations director role, managing a team of over 30 people and overseeing a portfolio of vendor relationships worth several $100 million annually. I want to be honest that I did not build this career with any specific plan to eventually confront my father's company. I built it because it was the work available to me, work I turned out to be genuinely skilled at, and work that gradually restored a sense of professional identity I had feared losing entirely when I walked away from Corbin Industrial Supply. In 2019, I made a decision that would eventually matter enormously, though I did not fully understand its significance at the time. A former colleague from my early years at Corbin Industrial Supply, a woman named Diane Okonkwo, who had left the company several years after I did, approached me about joining a small private investment group she had helped establish, focused specifically on acquiring distressed industrial and chemical distribution companies across the Mid-Atlantic region. I said, "Diane, that's a specific and fairly narrow market. What makes you think there's real opportunity there?" She said, "Nathaniel, you understand this industry better than almost anyone I've ever worked with, from both the operational and financial side. I've watched several mid-sized distributors in this region struggle over the past few years, carrying debt structures that made sense a decade ago, but that haven't kept pace with how the industry has actually evolved. I think there's real opportunity in acquiring and modernizing companies like that." I joined her investment group, called Meridian Industrial Partners, initially in an advisory capacity, contributing modest personal capital alongside a small handful of other investors, and gradually taking on a more substantial operational role as the fund's holdings grew over the following several years. By 2022, Meridian Industrial Partners had successfully acquired and restructured 4 distressed regional distribution companies, building a genuine reputation within the industry for identifying struggling businesses with sound underlying operations but poorly structured debt, and turning them into stable, profitable enterprises through careful financial restructuring rather than aggressive asset stripping. I want to be honest that throughout these years, I maintained almost no contact with my parents. Rachel and I built our own life entirely separate from the Corbin family's world, and while I occasionally heard second-hand updates about the company through industry contacts, I did not seek out information about my father's business, nor did I harbor any specific plan involving it. That changed in the fall of last year, when Diane brought a specific opportunity to my attention during a routine investment review meeting. Diane sat across from me in our firm's modest conference room, reviewing a stack of potential acquisition targets our research team had identified over the previous quarter, when she reached a specific entry near the bottom of the list. She said, "Nathaniel, I want to flag this one specifically, since I know it's likely to be uncomfortable given your history. Corbin Industrial Supply is on our radar. Their debt position has deteriorated significantly over the past several years, and industry contacts are suggesting they're approaching a genuine liquidity crisis." I sat with that for a long moment before responding. I said, "Tell me what you know." She explained that Corbin Industrial Supply, under my father's continued leadership over the previous decade, had struggled to modernize its operations and logistics infrastructure at the same pace as competitors, gradually losing market share to more agile regional distributors, including, notably, several companies Meridian Industrial Partners had itself acquired and restructured over recent years. Compounding this operational decline, my father had taken on substantial debt roughly 6 years earlier to fund an ambitious warehouse expansion project that had never generated the projected returns, leaving the company carrying a debt burden that its shrinking revenue base could no longer comfortably service. Diane said, "Our research suggests they're roughly 8 to 10 months away from a formal liquidation proceeding, unless they can secure either a significant capital infusion or a controlling acquisition that restructures the underlying debt." I asked her directly, "Has my father's leadership team explored any acquisition possibilities yet?" She said, quietly, "Yes. Their investment bank has been discreetly testing interest among a small number of qualified private buyers, structured entirely through non-disclosure agreements and blind representation, given the sensitivity around a company of their regional standing potentially facing liquidation." I want to be completely honest about the specific emotional complexity of what followed over the next several weeks. I did not immediately decide to pursue this acquisition out of any specific desire for vindication against my father. I sat with the information for nearly 2 weeks, discussing it carefully with Rachel, who had, over our years together, developed her own clear-eyed understanding of exactly what my family had put me through, without ever encouraging any specific animosity toward them on my behalf. She said, during one of our conversations about the situation, "Nathaniel, whatever you decide here needs to be about the business decision itself, not about proving something to a man who hasn't spoken to you in over a decade. If the acquisition makes sense purely on its financial merits, pursue it. If you're doing it mainly to settle an old score, I think you should sit with that motivation more carefully before moving forward." I took her advice seriously. I asked our research team to conduct a completely independent financial analysis of Corbin Industrial Supply, evaluated purely on its operational and financial merits, without any consideration of my personal history with the company. The analysis confirmed what Diane had originally suggested. Corbin Industrial Supply possessed genuinely sound underlying operations, a loyal customer base built over 4 decades, and valuable warehouse infrastructure, all of it currently undermined by a debt structure that had simply grown unsustainable relative to the company's actual cash flow. It represented, on pure financial merits, exactly the kind of acquisition target Meridian Industrial Partners specialized in restructuring successfully. I decided to move forward, structuring our firm's approach entirely through the same blind, anonymous representation Diane had described, working through our investment bank contacts to submit a preliminary offer without revealing my own identity or connection to the company at any stage of the initial negotiation. I want to explain honestly why I chose to maintain that anonymity, since I think it matters for understanding everything that followed. I did not want my father's leadership team, or my father himself, making any decision about this acquisition based on emotional reaction to my involvement, whether that reaction ran toward stubborn refusal out of pride or TOWARD Chinese letter, complicated hope that family connection might soften the actual financial terms required to save the business. I wanted the negotiation to proceed entirely on its objective merits, exactly the way any other Meridian Industrial Partners acquisition would proceed. Our preliminary offer, submitted in late fall, proposed acquiring a controlling 65% equity stake in Corbin Industrial Supply, structured alongside a comprehensive debt restructuring that would immediately resolve the company's most pressing liquidity crisis. In exchange for board control and a mandate to implement the operational modernization the company had failed to pursue over the preceding decade. My father's leadership team, facing a genuine deadline before formal liquidation proceedings would become unavoidable, accepted our preliminary terms and moved into detailed due diligence over the following 6 weeks. The final negotiation meeting, where all parties would formally review and sign the acquisition agreement, was scheduled for a Thursday morning in my father's own conference room, the same room where I had once worked directly under him nearly 2 decades earlier. I want to describe that Thursday morning carefully, because it remains, even now, one of the strangest and most emotionally complicated experiences of my entire life. I arrived at Corbin Industrial Supply's headquarters alongside Diane and our firm's legal counsel, walking through a lobby I recognized instantly despite the passage of over a decade, past a reception desk staffed by someone I did not know, toward the same conference room where countless family business meetings had once unfolded during my years working directly beneath my father. My father's leadership team, including the company's chief financial officer and their outside legal counsel, were already seated when we entered. My father himself sat at the head of the table, visibly older than the man I remembered, his posture carrying a specific strained composure that told me clearly how much this meeting actually meant to him, despite his evident effort to project calm professional confidence. He looked up as we entered the room, and for a long moment, his expression registered simple, polite confusion. The specific look of a man trying to place a face he recognized, but could not immediately connect to any relevant context. Then recognition arrived all at once, and I watched his face shift through several distinct stages, confusion collapsing into disbelief, disbelief collapsing into something that looked unmistakably like genuine shock. He said, "Nathaniel." I said, "Hello, Dad." The room fell completely silent. His own legal counsel glanced between us, clearly trying to understand the sudden shift in atmosphere, while Diane and our own attorney remained quiet, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. My father said after a long pause, "You're the buyer. Meridian Industrial Partners is you." I said, "I'm one of several partners at the firm, yes. I've been involved with Meridian for approximately 5 years now." He said, "You've been sitting across from us this entire negotiation, and you never said anything." I said, I asked our team to structure the approach anonymously, deliberately, so that this negotiation could proceed entirely on its actual financial merits, rather than on whatever complicated feelings might otherwise have entered into it from either side. He sat with that for a long moment, and I want to be honest that I watched something genuinely difficult move across his face in that silence. An old man confronting, all at once, both the son he had disowned over a decade earlier and the specific reality that this same son now held the controlling financial leverage over the survival of everything he had spent 4 decades building. He said, eventually, in a voice noticeably quieter than the tone I remembered from our final conversation years earlier, "Nathaniel, I need to understand something. Is this retaliation? Are you here to punish me for what happened between us?" I said, "No. I want to be honest with you, Dad. When Diane first brought this opportunity to me, I sat with that exact question for nearly 2 weeks before deciding whether to move forward. I asked our research team to evaluate this acquisition purely on its financial merits, independent of our history. It passed that evaluation completely. This company has strong underlying fundamentals undermined by a debt structure that stopped making sense years ago. That's the entire basis for this offer, nothing more and nothing less." He said, "And the terms themselves, are they going to be fair, given everything that's happened between us?" I said, "The terms are exactly what our firm would offer any comparable acquisition target, regardless of who owned it. 65% controlling equity stake, a comprehensive debt restructuring that resolves your immediate liquidity crisis, and board control that allows us to implement the operational modernization this company has needed for years. Your remaining 35% equity stake retains meaningful value going forward, assuming the restructuring succeeds the way our analysis suggests it will." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something I had genuinely not expected to hear from him, delivered with a specific unfamiliar humility I had never once witnessed from my father during all the years I had known him. He said, "I was wrong, Nathaniel. Not just about Rachel, though I was certainly wrong about that. I was wrong about what actually mattered, and about what kind of man deserved to eventually run this company. I spent 10 years building a narrative where you'd thrown everything away over sentiment, and it turns out you built something more substantial than I ever gave you credit for being capable of, entirely without this family's resources behind you." I said, "I appreciate you saying that, Dad. I want to be honest that I'm not here today primarily to hear that acknowledgement. I'm here because this is a sound business transaction that happens to also resolve a genuine crisis for this company and the people who work here." He said, "Can both things be true at once? The business transaction and something closer to an actual reconciliation between us?" I said, "I think they can be, if you're genuinely willing to meet Rachel properly this time, and if you're willing to accept that whatever relationship we rebuild from here happens on entirely different terms than the ones you tried to enforce a decade ago." He agreed to those terms without hesitation, and the formal acquisition closed 3 weeks later, resolving Corbin Industrial Supply's debt crisis entirely, and placing the company under Meridian Industrial Partners' operational control, with my father retaining a meaningful ownership stake and an advisory role rather than being pushed out of the business entirely. I think often about the specific coldness in my father's voice that evening at the family dinner table, telling me plainly what it would cost me to choose Rachel over the life he had already mapped out on my behalf. And I think, just as often, about the very different voice I heard from him across that conference room table over a decade later, finally acknowledging what he had gotten wrong. I did not orchestrate this acquisition as an elaborate act of revenge, and I want to be honest that if I had approached it that way, I do not think it would have unfolded nearly as cleanly or as meaningfully as it eventually did. I pursued it because it made genuine financial sense, and because the specific discipline of evaluating an opportunity purely on its own merits, entirely independent of old grievances, turned out to be exactly the discipline that gave this entire story its eventual resolution. Rachel has since met my father twice, both times handled with a careful, deliberate grace on her part that I do not think I could have managed as evenly myself, given everything our family put us through. My father has not yet fully closed the distance an entire decade of estrangement created, and I do not expect that distance to close overnight simply because a business transaction forced an honest conversation neither of us had been willing to have otherwise. What I know clearly now, in a way I did not fully understand as a younger man still trying to satisfy my father's specific vision of what my life should look like, is that the life I actually built, quietly, patiently, entirely apart from my family's resources and expectations, turned out to be sturdier and more genuinely mine than anything I would have inherited by simply following the path already laid out for me. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments about a time your own family tried to control a decision that was genuinely yours to make. Subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell, because every week I bring you a story like this one, real and worth every minute of your time. I read every single comment. Thank you for being here.